Hi everyone, my name is Tairan Qiu and my pronouns are she, her, and ta. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of Georgia. Welcome to my qualitative concept mini lesson focusing on coming up with a topic for qualitative research that brings you light and joy. One quick note before we start. Closed captions can be accessed by clicking the CC button on the bottom right of this video. We have a very packed agenda today. In our mini lesson today, first we'll discuss how your ecology and ontoepistemologies shape your research purpose. Then you'll actually think about what your research purpose is and come up with a draft for your research question. In the end, I'll share some reminders and lessons that I learned throughout my experiences of doing qualitative research thus far. Here are the learning objectives for today. Before we dive into the first activity, I would like to share an example of how my own ecology and my own ontoepistemologies shaped my research design. As you may have noticed, the theme of the slides are very nature and ecology oriented. I did this very intentionally because I want you to think about your own ecology as we go through this mini lesson. Your ecology really shapes your understandings of the dire issues in your field of study. When you reflect on your ecology, you reflect on what makes you who you are today. I also challenge you to think about questions like what nourishes you, what keeps you alive and gives you joy. All of these things are a part of your ecology, and I hope through the activities that we'll do later, you'll really think about these questions and think about what are the important parts of your own ecology. In terms of ontoepistemology, ontology is a branch of philosophy that studies concepts such as existence, being, becoming, and reality. And epistemology is the study of knowledge. So really, when thinking about ontoepistemology, we're thinking about how are we existing in this world and how do we know what we know. So in my positionality narrative that I'm sharing with you right now, I answer the questions that I mentioned, and I also articulate my research purposes. Here is the link to my positionality narrative. You can also access the document through the QR code on the slide. Please take some time to read this on your own. So that was my positionality narrative that really answers the central question, what is my ecology and what are the ontoepistemologies that shape not only my research design, my theoretical framework, but also my stance and mission in the research that I do. So thinking about the examples I gave you and the questions that I posed, I want you all to reflect on your own ecology and ontoepistemologies to think about your research purpose. On a piece of paper, please answer these questions. What is important to me? What is important to the people in my community? What is important to the bigger context? What's important to the system and institution? And what is important to the world? After thinking about what is of importance to you in educational research or your field of study, answer the next two questions. How do my answers to the above questions shift my research purpose? What do I do? Why do I do this research and the work? And that depends on however you define what the work is. These questions will also help you think about the purpose and significance of your research, which are things you need to articulate as you write about your research further down the road. So take 10 to 15 minutes, pause this video, and jot down your initial answers to these questions. All right, hopefully you spent a fruitful 10 to 15 minutes reflecting on your ecology and ontoepistemology and doing the research and work that you do. Now let's share your responses. You can put it in the comments in the video or the comments on QualPage, or you can share it with whoever is watching this video with you. Now that you've reflected on your ecology and ontoepistemologies, and hopefully you have some thoughts about your research purpose, like why are you doing the work that you're doing and what shapes the why, now we're going to think about your research topic in more specific and concrete ways. The way I do this is through writing research questions. Please keep in mind that these research questions don't have to be your final research question. Qualitative research is an iterative process, and we need to let the research process guide us as researchers. The research question you're writing right now could be a running draft of just your thinking, but it's important to have a draft for your research questions before you dive into the theoretical framework, literature review, and methodology, and all those little nitty-gritty things of qualitative research. Okay, now let's talk about the components of a research question. But before we do that, I would like to share my research questions with you. In my dissertation study, I asked 2 questions. Specifically, I wanted to examine 2 things. I look at what are the transnational literacy practices of a China-US transnational youth, Mei. Then, after knowing the what, I wanted to know the how. So I asked, how does Mei navigate these literacy practices and her translingual and multiliterate life across different contexts? So in both questions, I really have the who, right? One China-US transnational youth. And then I had the what. It's the transnational literacy practices and navigating her translingual and multiliterate life. I also had the where, right? Across context and across multiple countries. So these are the very basic components of a research question: the who, what, and where. This information really gives yourself and the readers of your research the context of your research. As such, when you write your research questions, when you're brainstorming, write down the who, what, and where. And then the when and how can be optional, but they're also very important components depending on what you really want to study, right? For example, if you're doing research about the effect of students quarantining at home and online learning on their mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic, then when is very important, right? So that's when you have to include the time frame of your research in your research question. And then if your methodology is important to your research, then you have to include the how in your research question. For example, if you're doing narrative inquiry, then narratives are probably very central to your research process. Hence, in your research questions, you would probably have to include narrative or storytelling, right? Another example is if you're doing arts-based approaches, such as poetic inquiry, then you would probably have to include some aspect of poetry or arts-based methodology or methods in your research question. And then if you're doing critical counter story as your methodology, then you would definitely include counter storytelling in your research question. So overall, the when and how is optional, but if they're of importance to your work, then you have to include them in your research questions. All right, why don't you pause the video for another 10 minutes to brainstorm the who, what, where, when, how, and write down a draft of your research question or research questions. But be cautious not to write down too many, right? Because we want the research questions to be practical and doable within a certain limited time frame. All right, I'll see you in 10 to 15 minutes. All right, welcome back. I hope you had a fun time drafting your research questions. So now I want you to engage in some peer and self-conferencing. You can either do this yourself, or if you have a friend who's watching this video with you, or if you have a peer who's also trying to figure out a topic for their research, you can do conferencing for each other and workshop your research questions. I can't emphasize how important it is to bounce our ideas off of each other with our peers or people who are in our academic community. And while you're doing the conferencing, I really want you to think about these questions. Is the research question specific but open-ended for possibilities for answer? So if you wrote down something like, does 7th graders like doing homework when they go home? Something like that. Then the answer to that question is yes or no, right? So that's not very open-ended. So really wordsmith your research question so it's open-ended and it's open for possibilities and of different answers. Something else to think about is the research question practical and could it be answered through one project within a certain time frame? If you ask a question like, what are the impact of race in teacher education programs? Then that could be your whole career, right? You could use your whole career to answer that question. So really think about your research question and think about how practical it is and could it be answered within a certain time frame of one study. Next, think about if the research question could be answered using research traditions and qualitative research. So this question is really for you to reflect on your choice of methodology. Like, does your question need to be answered through a survey, or do you need numbers or a large number of participants to answer your question? If so, then it's probably not a very good research question for qualitative research. So really think about the potential methods and methodologies that you're going to use to answer your research questions, and think if your research questions match research traditions and qualitative methodology. Lastly, think if there are any terms that the researchers need to operationally define in their work. We have different understandings of different terms in our respective fields, so we shouldn't assume that everyone knows what the words we use mean, or that there are universal definitions of these terms we use. When you're looking at your research question, really think, okay, do I need to define this for my readers so I'm crystal clear and they know what I'm talking about? And if your answer is yes, then definitely operationally define the words that you're using. For example, in my research question, specific terms that I need to define in my theoretical frameworks or methodology sections are transnational literacy practices and also transnational youth, right? People can assume the meaning of these terms, but I want them to understand my operational definitions of these things, because my understandings of transnational literacy practices are informed by theories of multiliteracies and translanguaging. This conceptualization is specific to my understanding of my theoretical framework, my ecology, and ontoepistemology. So these are the terms I need to operationally define in my writing and when I articulate my research. So for this last conferencing question, thinking about your research question, I want you to write down the terms that you need to define for your readers so they know exactly what you're talking about in your research questions and in your writing. All right, let's take some time and do some peer or self-conferencing to workshop your research questions. All right, welcome back again. So hopefully you had a fruitful time with me in this mini lesson about coming up with a research question for your qualitative research project that brings you joy. In this presentation, I talked about some strategies that you could use for thinking about and reflecting on your own ecology and ontoepistemologies, coming up with your research purpose, and also starting a draft of your research questions. Before I let you go, I want to share some reminders or some takeaways that I have through my experiences of doing qualitative research during my doctoral program. The first thing is, when composing your research questions, be specific and practical. The conversations with a peer reviewer or even yourself using those questions that I provided is really important. It really helps you hone in on the specificity of your research questions and think about the practicality of your research questions. To me, my thinking flourishes in specificity. Next, be reflexive and flexible in your research process. Keep a research memo, because throughout the research process, you're going to learn a lot of new things, either about your research partners, your context, or your research methods. Or even you're going to gain understandings of your theoretical framework or the literature that you've already read or are reading. So really be willing to be flexible, keep an open mind, and always reflect on your methods of inquiry, your interactions with your research partners, and your growing understandings of your work. As such, keeping your researcher memo is central in your research process. Next, be willing to revise your research questions and unlearn, right? We were always taught that before we go into the field, we have to know everything, all the literature, all the theoretical framework, all the methods. But that's not true. Our research questions is a temporary guide for us to walk into the work with our research partners that we work with. Also, we can't freeze ourselves in time, right? As we learn and engage in reflectivity and reflexivity, we have to be willing to revise our research questions when necessary and be willing to learn and unlearn about our research partners or the context they're in and the work that we do. So be in constant conversation with your research partners, because in qualitative research, the people you work with, they are the experts about their lives and they're the experts about their experiences. So be a humble listener and listen to their experiences and be willing to revise what you think you already know. Next, don't try to be trending. Choose a topic that gives you passion and light. I can't emphasize this enough. I see people that want to jump on the bandwagon and use words such as diversity, equity, and inclusion in their research, or they think topics like the pandemic and educational research is trendy. But does that really give them passion and joy? I don't really know. So really choose a topic that gives you passion, light, and joy, and don't try to be trendy. The reason we do our work and the purpose we do our research is not to be trendy. It's to actually make changes in the areas and spaces that we think are important in educational research. Lastly, before we part ways, I want to share 2 questions that I'm constantly thinking about as I work with my research partners and design new projects. Who are you in relation with, and who are you answerable to? I challenge you to really dive deep into these questions and have them at the back of your mind and the front of your mind as you come up with your research topic. Here are my references, and thank you for listening to me. And if you have any questions, please contact me. Good luck on coming up with a topic for your research.